take a look at a basic example to identify the difference between the strategy, the response, and the audit procedures. Let's assume that my risk at a particular client is their stock. Their inventory, for some reason or the other, is a higher risk. Depending on exactly what that risk is going to depend on the audit strategy, the impact on the plan, as well as the procedures. In order to identify and illustrate the differences here, we're going to assume that there might be two potentially different risks, and we'll see exactly how these change for the strategy, the plan, and the procedures depending on the risk that we've identified. Let's assume at client number one, their risk in terms of stock is existence. You're worried about the fact that the stock might not actually exist. It's subject to theft. There's a possibility that the stuff doesn't actually exist, it was never bought in the first place. Versus client number two, you're a little bit more worried about the obsolescence of those goods. You're happy that they exist, but you are worried that potentially they are not worth what they are recorded for on the books. These are two very different types of risks. In this case, existence is a risk, where in case number two, your valuation is a bigger risk rather than your existence itself. Let's see how this would change as far as each of our components of our plans are concerned. We start with our audit strategy. How would these two risks affect the audit strategy? Knowing this about your client, how would this affect your strategy in both cases? We've said already, strategy is about resources. So let's ask ourselves, is there a possibility that the people, and when we're dealing with people, we're talking about of people, and this is your audit clerks, or the skill levels, would they differ if I was trying to respond to existence or obsolescence? The time, is there a possibility that I need to allocate certain times to this thing? Is there a possibility that locations are going to come into this? I actually need to get people to different areas. What about computers? Or any other kind of hardware or software, other types of resources that I need? Let's take a look at this. When I'm looking at an existence problem, at a client, I'm worried that their stock doesn't exist. Do I need people of a high skill, a medium skill, or a low level skill in terms of clerks? Chances are I could get away with a pretty low level skill, maybe a first year or a second year. They don't need to be very well experienced to be able to identify whether a box of stock actually exists or not. Time definitely needs to be done at year end. If I want to perform stock takes at a client, I need to make sure that I'm actually there at year end. Locations, I've got to make sure I am at specific branches. This might take a little bit of logistical planning to make sure I get clerks to different branches at year end, or I might even rely on other audit firms in those particular areas to do that stock take for me. The amount of people is going to depend on the amount of branches that I have. How many clerks do I actually need to get this done? We can see that this is not very much about the audit procedure itself, but it's about the logistics and the planning involved to make sure that I get the required level and amount of people to a specific area at year end at a specific time. Let's compare that to our obsolescence problem. If we take a look at the fact that I'm worried that my client's stock isn't worth what they said it would, do I necessarily need to be doing a stock take at year end? Chances are not. Although the item exists, my concern is that you can't sell it for as much as you bought it for. And that means a very different type of testing. And that's probably going to be done subsequent to year end. The best way to identify whether or not your stock is actually worth what you say it is to identify how much you sold it for, your basic NRV test. That needs to be done after year end, not at year end. The level of people that you need, potentially a medium level of skill is needed here. Someone to actually identify whether or not stock is worth what the client says it is, needs a little bit of a higher level to do analytics, to do reasonableness tests, subsequent events tests, to identify whether this is necessary or not. Do I need to send clerks out to different branches? Possibly not. I'm not worried that the items exist. I'm pretty happy they exist. I just want to identify whether they were sold for what they should be. I need to make sure then that my records are right. I need to make sure that the adjustments are done properly. That doesn't necessarily mean that I need to send anybody to specific areas. So there's a good possibility that the amount of people I would need to do this is actually going to decrease. So we can see, depending on my risks, the responses that I've created is going to depend on the resources that I allocate to this particular item. Let's take a look at my audit plan. My nature, my timing, and my extent is the popular categories that we split our audit plan into to take a look if this would differ. Based on what I understand about an existence risk, the nature would be a physical inspection test, making sure I actually attend the stock take at year end, whereas my obsolescence problem is going to be an NRV versus cost test, identifying whether or not those items are sold for more than we bought them for. The timing, again, we've got to make sure that this is done at year end. In other words, my evidence has to be obtained at year end, whereas this is more likely to be done after year end. The extent of this is going to depend on the level of risk. Depending on just how high I identify these two as a possible risk in terms of an inappropriate opinion, I'm going to have to decide on the sample size, how many items, how many branches do I need to go to, as well as the level of reliance that I can place on this particular item. Again, we can see that the risks that we identified and the components of those risks is going to filter down to your strategy and your resources, and the answer for these two are going to look quite different at the end of the day. The procedures themselves, the specific audit procedures, the best way to understand these are the specific instructions that you're going to give your clerks. You're going to set and identify a particular list of instructions for each of these clerks that are going to perform these jobs so that they know step by step exactly what they need to do to get the evidence that they want. Audit procedures, you guys are generally quite comfortable with. This is where we talk about attend the stock take at year end, obtain representation from management, cast lists, add up lists, etc., etc. These types of things we're generally quite comfortable with. What we're not so sure about and what students aren't so comfortable with is the fact that these procedures here stem directly from the decisions that have been made at the top here. What you should have identified, or what you should notice, is that it's very difficult to split these two. What we do here is very dependent on what we decide here. We decided here that items need to be done at year end, and the levels of skill needed for the particular job, you'll see that these two are very interlinked. It's very hard to separate them, and you'll see in terms of the standards as well, they keep talking about the fact that subsequent to the completion of the assessed risk, identifying exactly what you need to do. There's a very circular way of doing this. The strategy is going to depend on the plan, which depends on the strategy, which depends on the plan. But at the end of the day, if we split it between the resources and the types of things that need to be done, and identify very specifically the type of evidence that needs to come out of that particular item based on the risk that's been identified, we can see exactly how these two answers would differ.